Well, good afternoon, and that is true. I am the Forrest Gump of molecular diagnostics, according to many people that I know. And I tell you, had I known that we were going to plan for two big games to be in Mississippi, we would have had this on Friday instead of Monday, and we could have gone to see the game. My son has reminded me 15 times this week that ESPN Game Day is in Oxford and not Athens. And so as a Georgia Bulldog, I keep getting reminded of that this week. But listen, I'm privileged to be here. I want to tell you that my prayer before I came up here earlier was that God would take my ego and pride and it would shrink in the shadow of Jesus Christ's cross. Because when you hear my story, it really is a Forrest Gump story. And I can't pretend to have had anything to do with it other than say yes, ma'am, and yes, God in my life. So what I want to do is walk you through how a country boy from Georgia got to where I am today, which many would argue it's way over my head and way over my pay grade, and I would probably argue that as well. But somehow, through the grace of God, I've been sustained in this business and this industry, and it's been a blessing to watch God allow science to unfold the mysteries of Himself through creation, all the way through the genetic revolution, and now into the utility of that into science. And so what I want to do is take you through a little bit of my story. I have a very unlikely adventure, and I'm the oldest of what we call a litter of grandkids from a little town in Georgia, middle Georgia. It's a suburb of Atlanta now, but when I was growing up, we had a two-lane highway in, two-lane highway out. We had one red light. We didn't even have a McDonald's. We had a Dairy Queen. And my family all grew up. We grew up very humbly. Everybody, all my uncles and aunts, and my mom and dad, everybody worked in one of three places. They either worked for Delta Airlines, they worked for Ford Motor Company, or they worked for the brewery in town. A few of them worked at the textile mills that are a little south of where I grew up. But bottom line is, the moms and dads all worked very hard jobs. And my grandmother, who was an amazing woman, kept all the grandkids during the afternoon after school and kept us during the summer. And I was very fond of my grandmother. And as the oldest of these grandchildren, and those of us now, because I get to speak often, but rarely in the South, there's a patriarchal expectation of the oldest grandson. And at 11 years old, my mom came in one night and was talking to my father, and she goes, Meemaw, because I was the oldest, I couldn't say grandma, so I named her Meemaw. She said, Meemaw's got the C word. And I'm like, well, what's the C word, Mama? And she said, the C word, well, you know, we don't talk about that here. She goes, it's cancer. It's cancer. She's got breast cancer. And I'm like, why is she whispering? And so, long story short, my grandmother did have breast cancer, and she had a radical mastectomy and had radiation, and I was wondering what the heck it was about, and I was and still am a very inquisitive kid. God created me that way, and I ask a lot of questions. And so by 13, my grandmother, who's told she was going to die by the time I was 12, she had come through it thanks to her faith, and just, as I like to say, my grandmother was meaner than the disease, and I got stripes on my rear end to show it. But she was sitting on the front porch with me one night, and we were swinging on a little glider. I don't have to explain what that is here in the South. When I speak in California and say glider, what the heck? They think it's a big airplane. I'm like, no. And so she grabbed my hand because I was asking all these questions, and she said, Ronnie, she said, I love you. You are gifted. God has given you a great brain. She goes, I can't answer the questions, but I want you to go off to college, be the first person in our family to go to college and cure this disease. And at 13, I was dumb enough to believe my grandmother knew everything, so I said, yes, ma'am. And I was headed off. And so I'm going to fast forward for today's sake. Hopefully when my book gets published, you can read the rest of that story. But she sent me on a task that I candidly had no idea how challenging, but how rewarding it was going to be. And my grandmother saved about everything she had to send me off to college, but I realized as I got to be 17 that that wasn't going to work. I was a soccer player. Didn't have many of those back then, but I wasn't big enough to play quote-unquote football. But I realized the only way for me to go to college was to play football. It was the only way I was going to get a scholarship. And so spring of my junior year, 11th grade, I walked out and I told the football coach, I said, hey, look, I want to do more than kick next year. I was a kicker on the team at the time. I said, I need to get a scholarship, and nobody's giving me an opportunity as a kicker. And I said, I need to do something else. And he looked at me and said, Ronnie, you're crazy. He said, you'll get killed out here. I said, I don't care. I need to go to college. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, you go home and gain 30 pounds this summer, and you come back and I'll give you a shot. So I said, okay. So I went home, and I gained 30 pounds that summer. It was easy. I went home and told Mima, I got to gain 30 pounds to play football. And she said, I'll put 30 pounds on you. So biscuits and fried chicken and gravy and grits, and oh my gosh, it was great. Thank God I got good genetics, which I now know I didn't know then. And so I gained 37 pounds. I showed back up, and as a little guy, God made me fast, thank God. So I ended up trying out, made it, and I won't bore you with the whole story, but I played in a 4A school, and I got to play against guys like Willie Gault and a number of guys like Scott Warner and Freddie Gilbert, guys that ended up playing in the SEC. And I wasn't big enough to go to those schools, but I started getting letters, and sure enough, God uniquely ordained me to play 4 years of college football at a little college called Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Division I AA school. And good news there is they might be bigger, but they're not as fast. In D1, they're big and fast. So I was fast enough. So I had 3 premises that have carried through my business career. Hit the big guy when they're not looking. Hit them with everything you got when you hit them. And be fast enough to get away before they get up. And that's how I have championed my business world in terms of taking on the Goliaths of the business world, is hit them hard, hit them fast, or hit them when they ain't looking, and get up and run when they can't, and when they get up. So my adventure basically took me through a whole process of really getting involved in science and understanding the sort of the premise of biochemistry, biology, molecular biology, and ended up in the world of science, in the world of diagnostics, and have spent 30 years in diagnostics. I had started a little company when was that? Boy, I better not say that. I'll tell you how old I am. Somewhere back in the 90s, I was working for a company called Abbott Diagnostics, and I had reached a point in my life where I felt like that maybe God was calling me into the ministry, because I was going to work every day. I was unfulfilled. I was dealing with people that were arrogant, mean-spirited. My boss screamed at me and threw stuff at me. It was like, it was just a horrible environment. Now, I know none of you guys work in a corporate environment like that, but it was brutal for me. And I went to my pastor of a little church in Chicago. We were living in Chicago at the time, right outside Chicago, and I said, look, I think I want to go into ministry. I need to go somewhere where I can practice my faith that I had been given from my grandmother, but I had not been able to find a place to do that. And I didn't like work, and I hated it, and I wasn't fulfilled. And he stopped me right at the beginning of breakfast. He said, Ronnie, don't you ever say that again. He said, you are in the ministry. He said, God has uniquely ordained you with the aptitude for a very complex science. He's given you an amazing story, and he's given you a gift. You get to be with people every day who don't know Jesus, and you get to be able to deal with them at the scientific level in a way that can help them understand that science does reveal the existence of a God and not confound that. And you need to stay there. You are in the ministry. And it's the first time I heard this word. He called it marketplace ministry. So at 36 years old, I left Chicago, went home, helped start a little company in Atlanta, and the company was going good. I spent the next 5 to 7 years deep in study around what I called servant leadership, trying to understand the leadership principles of Jesus. And in that process, that company took off, but that company wasn't in cancer. So my grandmother, I get a phone call one day from my mom, and she said, Ronnie, it's not good. Meemaw's got her 4th round of cancer. She was 82 at the time. And I was like, okay. And I was the only one that she would let take to the doctor, because I'm the only one in the family that has any type of medical background. So I went and got her. We went up to Emory. We drove the 90 minutes to Emory, see a doc whose name we couldn't pronounce, could basically care less about my grandmother. But I went there to interpret for her. He pulls me aside and he said, this isn't good. He told me what it was. Of course, I knew what it was. And I said, all right. So he said, we're going to do chemo? And I said, no, we're not going to do any more chemo. And I said, she's been through that. I think we're going to love her and let her go be with Jesus. And so she must have heard me, because we get in the car, and on the way home, she goes, Ronnie, the doctor said I was going to die, didn't he? I said, well, yes, ma'am. I can't lie to you, Meemaw. You taught me not to do that. So no, he said you're not going to make it. He gave us 6 weeks to 6 months. She looked me right in the eye. She said, Ronnie, you know what? You know how many times I've heard that in my life? And I said, yes, ma'am. She goes, God ain't gonna let me go home till he takes your granddaddy home, because he can't live without me. And she was right. 4 years later, my granddaddy died, and about 4 months later, my grandmother just decided she'd had enough, and she went downhill. On her deathbed, this was sort of the transition point of my life. I went and sat on her bed. She ran everybody out of the room. She grabbed my hand, and she said, Ronnie, you know what? She goes, back, remember when we were sitting on the glider in the front porch when you were a young boy? And I said, yes, ma'am. She goes, you promised me you were going to do something about cancer. And I said, yes, ma'am. And she goes, I'm going to go be with Jesus tonight. It's time for you to get to work. Very, very compelling. So I got up from there, a mess, as you might imagine, loved on her, walked outside. And my wife caught me at the door, and she says, you're going to quit your job, aren't you? And I go, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And so 17 years ago, I left that job. It was a great company, a little company called Immucor in Atlanta. We had moved back to Atlanta. We were happy. We had a great church home. I had my family there, because everybody's still, I'm the only one that's ever left the zip code. They still all live in Fayetteville and Fayette County, in Clayton County. And I ended up deciding I needed to go and chase this cancer thing. It was the greatest decision I ever made, because the next day I went and told my boss, who's a great man, a great leader, and someone who's compassionate about our causes. And he told me, he said, Ronnie, he said, I don't want to lose you, because we'd taken the company from nothing to $100 million. It was doing well. It had a market cap. We're public of about $1.2 billion at the time. And he said, but I get what you're after. And he said, go, if you're going to go get it with everything you've given me. And so I said, all right. So I had no idea how I was going to get there. But I began to pray about it, and I found the company. As a scientist, I found the company that had the technology coming out of the Human Genome Project called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. It was the amplification technology that was being used to amplify the Genome Project. So I'm not the smartest scientist in the world, but I put two and two together and realized that that was going to be the discovery platform for everything we needed to know to cure cancer. At least that was my thought. So I decided I don't know how to get in this company, but I need to get there. I got to figure it out. So I sat down and put my resume together. 2 days later, I got a phone call from the general manager of Roche Molecular in North America. Roche was the company that I needed to get into. He invited me up for a meeting. I went up there on Thursday. We had the meeting Thursday night and Friday. He offered me the job Friday afternoon to be the North American general manager for the business that owned the technology that was going to go and hopefully cure cancer. From there, fast forward a few years, I had been blessed, and I was now the head of global business as a billion-dollar business with this PCR technology. We had used it at the time to help make HIV a chronic disease, but we were pivoting our R&D resources as a billion-dollar division. I had $200 million in R&D, and we were putting about $100 million in oncology at the time. And then I get a phone call from Basel, and Basel said, hey, that's the headquarters of Roche, said, Ronnie, we decided we're not going to do cancer. We're going to back out of cancer for a while. So I said, well, that isn't what I got called here to do. God called me here and gave me stewardship of this to be in cancer. So obviously this isn't where I'm supposed to be. And we had looked at acquiring a little bankrupt company in Southern California that had the ability, keep in mind in cancer, I'm going to show you some slides in a minute, there's the genetic fingerprint, and then there's the proteomic output of that fingerprint, and you need to know both. And we only had one piece. We've been looking at a company to get us into the other, and so this little company, we decided not to buy them. Is bankrupt. The venture guys called me and said, we'll give you $15 million more if you'll leave Roche and come down and take this over and go do what you can to build a business. So I said, all right, I got to think through that. I prayed about it, told them no. Week went by, I didn't feel good, my stomach was hurting. Called me back, said, please come. I said no. Finally, about 3 weeks after I told them no as many times as I thought I could tell them no, I was scared, and I'd been through all my mentors and all the people that I used in life to counsel me, and I said, this is a big job, and I got a great job, and most of them were going, yeah, what would you even think about leaving the top of the diagnostics world as the leader of the world's most fastest growing and technology-oriented company to go be the CEO of a public bankrupt company? Are you crazy? And I said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And that's what I kept telling, no. And then one day, after church, one Sunday, I'm outside in my backyard in Northern California, and someone was eating at me, and I realized that I'd been missing one key point of advice, right? And that's the advice that comes from the book that my grandmother always told me to go to when I had a challenging decision, and not to read what was written in black, but read what was written in red. Now, my grandmother had one of those big King James red letter Bibles, and she always said, if you get confused about doctrine, don't read anything but red, because it tells the truth. And so I went to begin to read that, and one thing hit me, and it's this. My whole life had been about beating the odds, doing things that were impossible because I just believed God would help me do it. And here I sat saying no to an opportunity to take over a technology that could do cellular imaging of breast cancer that would allow us to change the course of how breast cancer was managed in the community. You see, at the time, women with breast cancer in the community didn't get treated the same way women that had breast cancer in big cities got treated, because all the academic diagnostic information was held at the MD Andersons and the MD universities of the world. And the women in rural America weren't getting access to that until they were stage 3 or 4, and we can't solve it at stage 3 and 4. And so I began to pray about it and realized that there's no way I could make that company successful, but God could. And I was going to take the leap and take it and go do it. So I did it, and most people thought I was crazy, including my wife. But she's been with me for 29 years now, and we moved 14 times, and she knows I'm crazy, so she just gets used to it. But I ended up going to this company. The first day I walked in, 28 employees, they're all standing around, been through a lot of trauma. And I told the vision about how I believe God had brought me there and how I believe we were going to do something powerful for women with breast cancer. And I told about my grandmother's story. And I got done, and I thought I'd given a great talk, and I walk up to the top of the stairs, and out comes this lady, and I'll let her name be unnamed. She wouldn't be named in my book. But she said, Ronnie, your God's not big enough to fix this company. You need to get back on that plane and go back north and get your job back with Roche. So I walked in first day and said, all right, is God telling me that this is the wrong decision, or is Satan trying to get in the way? So I quickly realized that, no, I was convicted. I believe God had brought me there. I got the 2 people I knew were Christians in my office. We got on our knees right there, and we prayed this prayer. We said, Lord, we have no idea what you have in store for this company. We have no idea. What we know is that you've called us here for a purpose, and you've called us here uniquely and ordained us in a very special way to be in a position to change the way health care is managed for women with breast cancer in rural, indigent communities. And we feel that is our passion. So we're going to do it your way. We're going to do it with servant leadership as the foundation, and we're going to try to build something out of this in your name. And so the story that you're going to hear now, and the story that we're going to talk about, is really the output of that story. You see, this quote from Hippocrates really bothers me, because how old is this dude? I mean, I was just in Greece. I took my wife. She just turned 50. Oh, it's on video. I'm dead. And I saw this guy's name, and I'm thinking, well, how old is that guy? This guy's before Christ. I mean, he's an old guy. And yet this quote still remains accurate, right? The art of medicine is long. Life is very, very short. Trust me, in my world, it's very short. And the reality is that the art of the experiment is perilous, and our judgment is flawed. But the beauty of the Human Genome Project, the beauty of sitting here 12 years later being the steward of companies that have now decided our mission in life is to take that learning and execute it in a way that will render this disease chronic, that is a powerful place to be, because we can change the last clause in this sentence. No longer does judgment need to be flawed when you're dealing with a cancer patient, because we now are 60 years, last year was the 60-year anniversary of Watson and Crick's famous discovery of DNA. And I love the quote on top of the Nature paper. It says this structure has features which may have considerable biological interest. I always laugh. I say that's the greatest understatement of the 20th century. DNA is changing our world. And the interesting thing about it is that the cost of sequencing, which is what my company now does, which is why I left my job at Clariant. Clariant got sold. I'll tell you that story in a second. That's another God's miracle. That got sold. I needed a job because my wife didn't like me at home. So I went out to get another job and ended up the steward of a $2 billion genetics division with all the technology in the world to advance this science. And you keep saying, how does this keep happening to you? I am Forrest Gump, y'all. I'm telling you. And so the beauty is that we are now taking the human cost to do one genome. It was $3.8 billion to do the Human Genome Project. It took us 13 years. We now can do a full genome in a week for about $3,000. And in a year or two, we'll be able to do a whole genome. We won't know what it means, but we'll be able to do a whole genome for $1,000. So the beauty is the cost of the science is coming down. The challenge is now, how do we relate that to information that helps us use it for good and to manage disease? And so one of the things we've learned in unveiling the mystery of cancer, there's a book by a guy named Siddhartha Mukherjee. He is an oncologist at Sloan Kettering, and he wrote a book on the history of cancer called The Emperor of All Maladies. And one of the things, if you read that quote, one of the things he talks about is these cancer cells are insidious, feisty little cells that keep reinventing themselves, which is why we have a hard time curing this disease. Stage 1 cancers, hot lights, cold steel, cut it out, boom, we can cure it. Anything past stage 1 these days, it's complicated. And the reason it's complicated is because even if you know the genetic fingerprint, there's the messaging of that fingerprint, there's then the proteomic or the protein output, and there's the impact of cell function. So what we are learning today is that it's the combination of those 4 buckets of information that are required to bring a positive outcome in oncology and in cancer. I get asked often, I get to speak quite frequently at Susan G. Komen. I'm a pink tie guy after my grandmother, and I've done a lot of this in her honor. I think it's a conspiracy that pharma companies just don't want to cure cancer. Well, look at this. This is the proteomic pathway map of EGFR, which is one gene out of 150 that we now know drive cancer. So if you can imagine that highway system, and the way I like to describe it is, and I apologize for the West Coast analogy, but I can't figure a traffic area as complex as LA, so it works. If the blueprint for cancer were developed in a downtown Los Angeles firm, in an architectural firm, and the manufacturing was out close to where I live in beautiful Laguna Beach, the idea is that there's all kinds of ways the courier could drive that blueprint to get to manufacturing, and keep in mind, no cancer is produced unless it gets to the manufacturing facility. So after the Human Genome Project, because we don't know how to change the blueprint, what the pharma companies began to do is pour hundreds of billions of dollars into drugs that would stop the highway system, would block the courier on a highway. This is the highway they're talking about. And what's happened is, the challenge is, if you remember that quote from Siddhartha, is the problem is we can stop it on one highway, but what we now know, the last 2 years we've figured out, there's more than one courier and they're on multiple highways. This is why we might stop phase 1 cancer. 2 years later, we think we got it cured and they show back up metastatic, because we didn't stop all the cancers, all the communication. So the challenge of cancer is very, very complex. But the beauty is we're making progress. And I always love to show this slide because this is a high-profile person from California. Clariant was the name of my company that we started. We were the pioneers of this molecular mapping of tumor tissue. We got this case. I got a phone call from the publicist of this person and said, we got a really serious thing. Can you help us? And I said, well, we'll do our best. So they sent us the tissue. We did a molecular map, and we found a rare mutation in this lung cancer that actually was normally seen in breast cancer, called an ERBB2 mutation. There are 7 drugs in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials that would block that highway system. We got this patient on it. The right-hand side, you see the tumors on the left? You can see that. I don't know if everybody in the room can see that. And you can see this is 6 weeks later after being on one of those experimental drugs, and that was 7 years ago, and the person was told they had 6 weeks to live. The beauty of what we're trying to accomplish in oncology now is to take this amazing technology and to marry it to the right drug cocktail early enough that we can have these amazing outcomes. And so my little company, Clariant, grew very, very fast. God ordained it. He blessed stories of how we had no idea how we were going to make payroll sometimes because we were growing so fast and working capital was running out. We did it on mezzanine debt. 2008, 2009, does that ring a bell? Does that bring back bad memories? Frozen markets, we're a public company. We weren't quite profitable. growing like crazy, ran out of working capital. The VC firm that was, oh, we're going to fund you, Ronnie, we're going to fund you. They decided, oh, we're going to fund you. We're going to charge you 33% interest. As the steward of a public company, I got on my knees and began to pray in January when they sent us the mezzanine financing tool, because I was looking at two options. One, 33% interest, or two, allowing the company to go out of business. And that wasn't going to happen on my watch, because I knew that wasn't what God had ordained this company. We'd grown from nothing to $100 million by then. And so I began to get, by then we were having Bible studies weekly at the company, and I had a pretty broad following of people that believed we were all there for a purpose. So we just had an open prayer session where about 100 people showed up, and we began to pray for God to show up. The week before the board meeting in February, when we were going to make this big decision, we still didn't have anything but convertible notes. So if those of you know financing and business financing, I don't have time to explain it other than they're nasty vehicles that tie you up at the end and don't allow you as a leader to have the freedom to make the decisions you need to make for your company, because everything has to go before a VC review board, so to speak. And so I just didn't feel good. I'd gotten out of personal debt because the markets were so bad and the economy in California was horrible. I mean, houses were dropping 50-60% of their value, and I saw friends around me going bankrupt, and I just decided that, no, we're going to go back to God's principles for finance. If I couldn't afford it, I didn't buy it, and we're going to get out of debt. So I got my family out of debt. It was painful for them, and my wife and kids to this day kicked me in the shin for making them do that, because we had some austerity moments. That was good for us as a family. But my company, I needed working capital. So we began to pray harder, and on Thursday I got a phone call from one of the most prominent VC investors in the industry. She said she'd like to fly out, and that she'd heard about us, and we heard we needed money. She came out on Thursday. Saturday we did due diligence. Monday she offered me a $40 million straight equity, no interest, no debt, no warrant equity offering for $40 million. Guess what? We needed 19 to clear the debt. We needed about 10 more to get this new product out, and then we'd be home free. So we showed up at a board meeting with this VC firm expecting to be able to get a 33% deal through, and we showed this with them. It was a great opportunity to testify to the power of prayer in business, because God spared that company, and a year later, not only did they double the market price and value, but on May 6th, I get a phone call. I'm sitting in my conference room, and my assistant knocks on the door, and we have a staff meeting. He says, Ronnie, Jeff Immelt's on the phone for you. I'm like, yeah, right. You know, for those of you who don't know, Jeff Immelt's the chairman of GE. And I said, I don't know Jeff Immelt. That must be one of my buddies busted my chops to get me out of this meeting. So I said, go tell him I'll call him back in 10 minutes. So she did. So I get out, and there's a little slip of paper, New York number. I'm like, uh-oh. So I called New York, and Kathy, his assistant, answered. He says, Kathy, it's Jeff Immelt's office. And, oh, Kathy, you don't know me, but you don't know what I just did. I told her. She began to laugh. She said, well, he needed to have his knees cut off today. So she puts him on the phone. He's laughing. It was a great discussion. Next thing I know, I'm having dinner with the chairman, probably the most powerful businessman in the world. And I'm sitting there at dinner trying to explain to him how my company was built on a foundation of faith and faith-based principles that GE might not appreciate, and if they did, whatever they needed to do, they couldn't oppress it, because it was the power of what made the company great. And you know what? Jeff actually gained a great appreciation for him and what he had been through. We began to talk about. He took over. I think most of you know he took over GE the week before 9/11. And he had gone through some tough times too. It was a great opportunity for two men just to have a conversation about the challenges of life and what they were going through. One thing led to another, and in December, well, I got to tell you this part because this is a fun part. In September, we were doing the deal, and in that deal, we reached a point where it was kind of tenuous on price and a couple other issues. And their team, they had 5 people at GE for every one of my Clariant guys. And so I get a phone call from one of my guys, and they said no mas. So he had given me a cell phone. I called him, and I said, Jeff, I need to come to New York, and I need to look you in the eye. I got some issues we need to deal with. He said, well, let's just do it over the phone. I go, no, I'm a Southern boy. He goes, oh, yeah, I forgot. And I said, I need to look you in the eye. So I flew up there. Of course, my board found out I was going. They got nervous because, you do a deal with GE. That's a big deal in VC world. So I had a whole crew of people then that went with me to make sure I didn't mess it up. We ended up getting the deal done, but the day we were flying up there, Clariant got named the #1 place in healthcare to work for under $500 million. And to me and to my staff, that was the greatest affirmation of what we had tried to create, which was a company built on the foundational leadership principles of Christ that got us really to a point where we were able to move that company forward. So we're going to run out of time. I'm in the middle of a book called 7 Ahas of a Very Unlikely Executive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead to this, because I want to talk a little bit about what made Clariant great and what I hope you'll leave here today with some knowledge of, and that is what can make your culture great. You know, Peter Drucker says culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I'm here to tell you, I've lived in the corporate world, I've lived in the startup world. Great strategy and great technology don't do great things. Great people do great things. And great people armed with some significant leadership underpinning can conquer the world, right? It's the only way it's ever happened. Leadership's not about title. Leadership is about influence. I watched my grandmother, who didn't have a title, didn't graduate from the 7th grade, but took care of any kid that she needed to in that community, whose mother was a single mom and couldn't afford health care, couldn't afford daycare. My grandmother kept them for free. Every Friday she would give them a grocery list and tell them to bring those groceries back so she would have food to feed the family the next week. At her funeral, I had the privilege of speaking. And when I stood up to talk, there's a room this big full of people, which is rare for an 86-year-old funeral. Half the room was under 40 years old. And so as I began to look around, I began to see faces I recognized. And as I asked for testimony, you started to hear people say, your grandmother inspired me. I'm a nurse. She inspired me. I'm a doctor. She inspired me. I'm a minister. She inspired me. And everywhere around the room, I saw the amazing influence of a servant leader. And I realized that's how I want to be. That's the legacy I want to leave. I want people to respect me, not for the accolades of business, but for how I make them feel when they're around me and how I encourage them and inspire them to be better at what God gifted them to do. And so if you think about leadership and you think about these laws, they relate back to the leadership principles of Jesus. At 35, when I was told I needed to be a marketplace minister, I spent the next 4 years figuring out what the heck does that mean. Jesus had a really simple leadership model. I thought it was put my King James Bible on my desk and invite people in my office, but people quit coming to see me. So then I realized that wasn't how he ministered to those in the marketplace. Jesus met people where they were. He met them physically and then emotionally first. Somewhere down the line, he earned the right to touch them spiritually. And as a Christian in the marketplace, I so often used to personally get this backwards and see this backwards, where people wanted to hit them with the spirituality, which comes across as judgmental, versus hit them with the love of Jesus first and let them know you care about them. And that's the one difference between servant leadership and other leadership models. And if you look at the leadership virtues of Jesus, and I offered to give this to Doug, and Doug, if you guys are interested, I'll leave you this. It's going to be a part of the book, but really, if you think about the leadership model of Jesus, he wasn't a wimpy guy in leadership. He was decisive. He made some very decisive moves. Hey, go throw the nets overboard and fish some more, right? Hey, we're going to the other side of the lake. Hey, we're going to do this. We're going to do that. But he always had time for people. In the crowd, as he's wandering through the crowd in Jerusalem, the lady touched his garment and knew he'd been touched. Jesus was a leader of touch. He wanted to be touched and to touch other people in a way that allowed them to understand who he was and why he was who he was. And as I think about leadership today, and I think about what I see in corporate America, but versus what we really need to see for sustainable leadership, the leadership values on the right are leadership. I've come to the conclusion the left is management. And too many corporations and too many leaders in this world today confuse management and leadership. Management's metrics and numbers, and did you hit your numbers? Leadership is about lighting the fire inside so you don't have to light it underneath them. So I want to leave you with that as we close, because I do want to leave some time for questions. There's a great book. You guys have probably read the book on the left, right? Jim Collins, Good to Great. Jim Collins took 20 companies, followed them over a number of years, and went back and did a very good assessment of what made those companies great. There's also a book called The 7 Pillars of Servant Leadership. I'm going to jump right to the punchline for time's sake. In Jim's book, the good to great companies that same period outpaced the S&P 500, 17.5 to 10.8. The servant leadership companies outpaced all of them, 24.2% to 10.8 and 17. So what's the moral of the story? The moral is this. We have a mission. If you're here today and you know Jesus and you ascribe to those teachings, there's nothing in the world keeping you from practicing that in your workplace. Nothing. Do not let the media tell you that. It is your story. God inspired you with that story. There are people in your workplace hurting that would love to hear your story if you approach it physically and emotionally first and save the spiritual piece till you earn the right to have that conversation with them. There's nothing that keeps me from talking about my love for Jesus. And I'm a CEO of a $2 billion division, and I do it every day. And people don't complain because I don't force it on them. I love them, and that's what I try to do is love them. I just follow the model of my grandmother. And I love this quote. I love Dr. Martin Luther King. I grew up in Atlanta, a very tough time in our world. But I love this man because I watched what he did to transform the mind share and the hearts of a generation. And I love this quote. The greatest good we can do for people is not to show them our riches, but to reveal in them their own. As leaders, our jobs is to flame up the gifts that God has given them. There is not a single person in this room, nor anyone that works for a person in this room, that God hasn't given very unique gifts to. And your job as a leader, as a steward of that person's role, of that person's life, when you get that contact with them, is to figure out what that gift is and flame it into fire for them. Because when you do that, you will set your course as a company to do great things, no matter how big or small your company is. Thank you for your time today, and we'll open it up for questions, Doug. We got one. Yep.
Yeah. How about just what you talked about science and
yep.
How that's developing?
Yeah, it's a great question because in California, I get the privilege of being a rare breed. I am a born-again Christian with scientific knowledge that confounds and confutes the traditional thinking of Darwinism and traditional thinking of evolution, but also of how the world came into existence. And through my path, one of my stops at Roche, I had the privilege of having at my disposal, right out of the Human Genome Project, huge mathematical engines that we're using to compute the genetics and the probability of these diseases. One of my staff members was on the patents that won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for PCR. Amazing human being. I love him this day. We still are close friends. He was Jewish by heritage, but atheist by learning, quote unquote. We were on an airplane. We're coming back from New York. I'd just given a talk, and I was all excited about all the great things we're going to do with the Human Genome Project. And I opened the USA Today, sat down, front page, boop, Human Genome proclaims Darwin's theories fact. And I'm like, really? Really? Started reading it. 98% of our genome is the same as the ape. Well, yeah, 97% is the same as corn. So here's what I said on the way back as he's sitting next to me. We're in this great debate, very heated debate, and people are like, wow, but this is how he and I went at each other. So we made a bet. He's a wine guy, I'm a wine collector. I said, I'll tell you what, David, I bet you a case of 89 Lafitte, which I could barely afford at the time, so I knew I had to win. I said, and I knew, by the way, my dad and I used to go through this battle all the time. Oh, you're going to go to hell, Ronnie, because you drink wine. Well, you know what? Jesus' first miracle, by the way, was turning water into wine. Not just wine, but the best wine. If you read the Greek on that, so it's not wine that's the sin, it's the overindulgence of the wine. So just for any of you that want to run me out of here, sorry about that. So he and I are sitting there, and we're having this conversation, and we get back, and we get the mathematicians in there, and we said, all right, there's 66 million pieces of genetic code that differentiate man from the rest of the animal kingdom. Let's do the math, and let's say, how many years would it take if all 66 pieces mutated at the same time and then evolved the way Darwin gradually described evolution? Well, the math came back, the Earth is 7 billion years too young for it to have evolved gradually. Okay, so that means, let's assume that some magical force caused these mutations. And we can debate, David, later who that magical force was. But let's assume that that was not an intelligent designer. Let's assume it just happened. What are the chances of 66 million pieces of genetic code evolving into a positive phenotype? Now keep in mind, when you have a genetic mutation, most of the time it's not positive. Right? That's when we have cancer. The chances of 66 million pieces of genetic code evolving into positive, all positive phenotypes is 1 times 10 to the 582nd. That's 582 zeros after your 10. Lee Strobel defines it this way. I love Lee. I'm a saddlebacker. I go to Rick Warren's church, and Lee was there for a while and wrote some great books, A Case for the Creator, Case for Christ. If you haven't read them, get them. They're great books. And he talks about this. The theory of the Big Bang Theory and the atheist decision, or their description of how the earth was created and how man was created, it's like all the pieces of nice Rolex watch laying in the forest. And over 1 billion years, the wind's going to finally blow the right way, so all those pieces come together and make a fine timepiece like a Rolex. Guys, it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a believer and intelligent designer. And I can promise you that. And I got more statistics, Doug. I could go on all day about that, but we're done. I got the hook. So anyway, listen, it's been a blessing for me today. I hope you enjoyed it, and God bless you guys. And go back and touch somebody in a leadership way today that makes them remember who you are and how you lead. Thank you.